Hello and welcome to Focus on the Bible. I am so glad that you are listening. I want to begin by inviting you to our services at Eastside. Begin at 9 o'clock for worship, followed by Bible classes for all ages at 9:30, and then at 10:30 for a second period of worship. In addition, we meet at 6 on Wednesday evenings for Bible study. We'd love to have you come and visit with us soon. We are continuing a lesson we began last week from Brother Granville Tyler, titled Standing Firm. And now, the late Granville Tyler.
You know, there are so many things said here in the Bible about being in vain. Jesus, in the 15th chapter of the book of Matthew, talked to certain people, and he said, "This people honoreth me with their mouth. They draw near with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men." And when Paul wrote to the churches of Galatia in the 2nd chapter of the Galatians and in verse 2, the Apostle Paul talks about his making a journey to Jerusalem. And I want you to listen to what he said in verse 2. "And I went up by revelation and communicated unto them the gospel which I had preached among the Gentiles, but privately to them which were of reputation, lest by any means I should run or had run in vain." He was concerned about his having run in vain. In the 4th chapter of this same book, or the book of Galatians, and in verse 11 he said, "I'm afraid of you, lest I have bestowed upon you labor in vain." And in the 2nd chapter of the book of Philippians, and in verse 16, "that you be blameless and harmless, the sons of God, without rebuke in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom you shine as lights in the world." Then in verse 16 he said, "Holding forth the word of life, that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain, neither labored in vain." And so he's suggesting here that if you will maintain your faith, and if you will accept and follow that and never waver, then unless you have believed in vain, the danger of actually failing and therefore every effort being in vain. Then there's another thing connected with this idea of being steadfast and immovable, when he said, "Therefore be steadfast," and so forth, and that is, all men are going to die. And so he explains here that inasmuch as we're going to die, and that's going to end our responsibility and our opportunities, there'll be no longer an opportunity. I don't know how many times he makes reference here, but there's no, I guess, even among the Corinthians, though they had discussions about, and there was controversy about many things in the church at Corinth, just as there's a great deal of controversy even among people today. But there's one thing, so far as I know, there was no controversy about, and that was that men are going to die. That the people at Corinth were, in the 18th verse, he suggests, "Then they also which are fallen asleep in Christ have perished." In other words, he reminds them of their brethren who had fallen asleep. And then you heard me read, "But now is Christ risen," and then he suggested in the next verse, "For since by man came death, by man came also the resurrection from the dead." So there are a number of places here he refers to death, and as he points out, "As in Adam all die, so in Christ shall all be made alive." It is necessary, therefore, that we be steadfast and unmovable, because in the first place, we're all going to die. How many times have I've had this happen to me several times, maybe when some person has passed away and maybe he's visiting ours, and we go up and look at the remains, and somebody comes walking back and say, "I meant to talk to him. He's a fine fellow. I wanted to speak to him, but I didn't get the opportunity." Well, it's too late now. If you know somebody who is not a Christian, if you know somebody who is not faithful, if you know somebody who is not doing the thing that he ought to do, then you must discharge your duty now, because it'll be too late after he's dead. And then another thing, if he doesn't pass away before you do, It may be that you yourself will die. And at the end of life, when death comes, then we're through so far as what we can do, our activities. Since all of us are subject to death, and since everything that we do today must be done while we're living, then we ought to be very cautious and careful and not waste opportunities to do. There's an expression in the book of Ecclesiastes in chapter 9 and verse 5, the living know that they shall die, but the dead know not anything. And sometimes people will read that verse and say, well, you see, even after death, there'll be no knowledge, nobody will know anything. Well, now, he isn't saying that there's not a hereafter and then we're not going to live in the hereafter. But listen to what he is saying. He said, the living know that they shall die, but the dead know not anything, neither have they any more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. But drop down to the very next verse and look at the last half of that verse. Neither have they any more a portion forever in anything that is done under the sun. So he's saying that all of us know observation and the statements of the Lord himself, that it is appointed unto man once to die, and after this the judgment. And then the idea that he's saying here that when he dies, so far as this world is concerned, so far as his activity, and then look down at verse 10. Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might. For there is no device, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in the grave whither thou goest. He is simply saying that when a man dies, so far as his activity in this life and in this world, he's through. He can't deal with things that, for example, in the 16th chapter of the book of Luke, in the story of the rich man and Lazarus that Jesus used, the rich man said to Abraham, send Lazarus back, that he may speak to my brothers, lest they come to this place. Well, so far as the rich man is concerned, he's gone beyond the reach of his brothers. And he wants Abraham to send Lazarus back, that they may talk to and that they may do something to divert and to cause them to so live and so act that they'll not come to this evil place. I've heard people say, if my mother didn't go to heaven, I don't want to go. If my father didn't go to heaven, I don't want to go. Well, that's men should be careful about saying that, because here's a man who is in torment, but he didn't want his brothers to come. And if a man is lost, he certainly won't want his people to come, and certainly we don't want to miss heaven. We're individual responsible for that. But the point I'm making, he's saying, therefore, inasmuch as you're going to die, do your very best to reach others about you who are going to die also. And when death comes, so far as your service is concerned, so far as your actions are concerned, that ends it. There's no way of preparing ourselves. I remember my grandfather talking, that was a long, long time ago. He lived to be an old man, and he was telling about a man that he had talked with, and apparently he understood and knew a good bit about the Bible, and yet he couldn't get him to take any action about it. He'd heard about Jesus, and he'd heard the truth as revealed in the Bible. And my grandfather, as I remember the story as he told it, was present when he was dying. And as he was talking to the people, he seemed to still to be rational. And he said, I wonder if there could be enough water between here and the judgment, between death and the judgment, where I could be baptized. And my grandfather said that was indeed serious, because it would be too late to experience something like that after you're dead. And of course that's so, and as expressed here, he's saying that you be steadfast and immovable in view of the fact that death is raging. Then another thing, in view of the resurrection. Did you notice, as I read here in the first part of this 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul lists at least 6 appearances of the Lord after his resurrection. And he's suggesting the idea that the very basis of the resurrection is the resurrection of Christ. And if Christ be not raised, then there's no hope for the resurrection of man. And as some evidently were back there, I mentioned a while ago there was no controversy about death, but there seemed to be some controversy about the resurrection. And some were actually arguing that there was no resurrection. And so he said, then if there's no resurrection, then is Christ not raised? And if Christ be not raised, our preaching's vain, and those of your loved ones who are asleep, they're certainly lost. They have perished. There's no hope for them. But there's a statement made in verse 19 I thought a lot about. If in this life only we have hope in Christ, we're of all men most miserable. I've heard preachers sometimes when they talk about a man's obeying the gospel, urge people to become Christians and obey the gospel because of the blessings it'll bring to you in this life. It'll make your home better. It'll make the people of the community have more respect for you, and it'll have a better influence on your family. All of that's good. But a man needs to learn to obey the gospel because it will save his soul.
Join us next week for the continuation of this lesson. Thank you so much. Have a great and wonderful day.